Semester number 2, lesson number 35. Our aim today is how did the civil rights era progressively bring about equality in the United States? And what we're really talking about with the civil rights era is bringing about equality for minority groups. The most specific example would be African Americans during this time. And really, what we're doing right now is we're making a shift. We've been talking about the Cold War. We've been talking about foreign policy, but at the same time, we need to also look at the domestic policy within the United States and how the people of the United States are being treated, or certain groups within the United States, which at this point is still somewhat of a problem. So the civil rights movement, the three things we're going to talk about today are the goals of this movement, the concept of civil disobedience, and the Montgomery bus boycott. This is going to be a 2-day lesson, so we'll have more stuff to talk about tomorrow. All right. Please keep in mind that for the next 2 days, I will be asking you to generate all the talking points. So come in prepared. All right, and that will be a quiz grade. If you do not have it, you will not get credit. So the first point we're going to talk about are the goals of the civil rights movement. And the goals of the civil rights movement are pretty simple. They wanted to eliminate, the African Americans and the minority groups wanted to eliminate legal segregation from American life. All right. Slavery had ended in 1865. So since 1865, African Americans were not slaves. However, that didn't mean they were not segregated. All right. Segregate means to separate. And segregation was still an acceptable practice throughout the United States. And we could see that especially in the South. And on the right, you have a sign here that was indicative of the this era of segregation, where you have drinking fountains. You have the white drinking fountain and the colored drinking fountain. All right. There were separate schools, water fountains, bathrooms, etc. Point number 2, we're talking about civil disobedience, and you can draw a connection, all right, to a guy from global history, Gandhi. All right. Civil disobedience is a form of protest that is nonviolent, and it is aimed at ending segregation. All right. This includes protests, rallies, marches, boycotts, but really what civil disobedience is when you purposely break the law in a nonviolent way. All right. And a perfect example of this during the time period would be sit-ins at a white-only restaurant counter. All right. The law said that only whites could sit at the counter in these restaurants that were set up basically segregated. And to break the law and bring light to this situation, African Americans would go in and they would sit at the counter, and really, what they would have to be subjected to was mocking and some sort of sometimes violent things, and they had ketchup and mustard dumped on them and flour thrown at them, and they sat there and they took it because they were making a point, they were making a stand, and we're going to talk more about that in class. So maybe develop a talking point on this. All right, and this is the picture I was talking about. All right, African Americans sitting at the counter and people dumping things on them, and it was dehumanizing and degrading, but at the same time they're getting a point across. And I want you to think about how bad they probably want to turn around and do something violent, but at the same time they did not. All right, and if we look at this picture, we could see the people at the counter. It's not just African Americans. All right, which is interesting because you think the civil rights movement is all about African Americans, but there were white Americans who believed that civil rights were so important for everyone that they fought for the cause, and they wanted minorities to be protected equally under the Constitution. All right. And the third thing we're going to talk about is the Montgomery bus boycott. All right. And this is led by Martin Luther King Jr., who we're going to talk a lot more about tomorrow. It was started when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on the bus. And it was required at this time that if a white person was standing, that an African American was obligated to give up their seat. Rosa Parks had a long day and she was tired. She refused to give up her seat, and she was arrested for that. After that happened, Martin Luther King organized a boycott, or they stopped using the bus system in Montgomery. All African Americans agreed to stop using the bus system until the change was made, allowing African Americans to sit on the bus even when whites were standing. And during this time, a good percentage, or the majority percentage of people who rode the bus were African Americans. So not giving them that business hurt the economy of the bus company. All right. The city passed an ordinance eventually authorizing black bus passengers to sit virtually anywhere they chose on buses because of this boycott. So they nonviolently brought about this change through economic, punishment. All right, the African Americans, was it inconvenient for them? Absolutely. But did they make a point? Yes. All right, and we're going to talk more about that during class, and which brings me to the next point is you need to develop some talking points, some discussions for us to have in class. And the final picture I wanted to show you is a picture of all the African Americans preparing for carpools during the boycott. All right, African Americans still needed to get from point A to point B during the boycott, and since they were not using the buses, they had to, band together and use what resources they had to get people to things like job, to get people to the doctor's offices, to whatever they needed to get to. So this was a way in which the African American community banded together. Those with cars, all right, and churches who had vehicles, they all pitched in, and you have 5 African Americans in the car going to work rather than one person. All right, so that is it for tonight. Please come in with questions developed, and we will talk more about this tomorrow. Have a good night.